Hello again, everybody. Welcome to our video for Chapter 2 for Money in Schools, which is really looking at the policy perspective of how schools are funded. So this is going to be one of the more difficult chapters in the textbook. My advice is you should refer to the charts and graphs to better understand it. I really want you to look at the PowerPoint, read the book, watch the video. If you have any questions, send me an email. I'm always here to help, but I want you to really look at this because it's going to be pretty difficult to understand without the charts and the graphs, and I'm not going to put them for display on a PowerPoint. I'm not going to scan something in and put it there. You can use the book and you can look at it, but I'm going to refer to it a lot. The other thing that I'm going to start doing in this chapter is going over the whole comparative school finance thing. We're going to talk a little bit about Florida, we're going to talk a little bit about Pennsylvania, we're going to talk a little bit about Ohio, Oklahoma, and I think that's going to be good. Also Alabama and Georgia, so you can see this overarching perspective of the point that I'm trying to make of this class is that this is really a state thing. Every state has their own different management systems, and the sooner you know that and are fine with that, the better you're going to understand your context. So our chapter questions are: what is the scope of education finance in America? How are education and economics related? What is the structure of school governance in America? Where do schools derive their financial support from? What's adequate and equitable funding for schools? And can schools at once serve economics, equality, productivity, and liberty? All of these are very difficult questions, and I think take a lot to really consider. So this chapter begins where the last chapter ended. They said basically that there's not a positive opinion of schools, and there's not. Research on linkages between student achievement and school funding levels is mixed. Some people say it does nothing. Some people say measuring the cost of education is nearly an impossibility. That makes justifying these expenditures even more challenging when you're looking at them. So because there isn't specifics with performance and funding, most of the time the local districts then decide this is what I'm spending my money on. And all of you are in systems where they might say, well, we're going to invest in technology, we're going to invest in infrastructure, we're going to invest in a 5-6 building, we're going to invest in an academy setting, we're going to do magnet schools. Really, the local districts make this decision, and it's important that they do it and they consider the context when they do this. The challenge is each district might want something different, and as long as they stay within those federal regulations and state regulations, they're fine. But if you jump from one county and one system to another, then what you thought was important might not be important in another setting. So that's a challenge in itself as well. So finding a way to balance that, another difficult thing that you need to consider. So there are not published or designed PowerPoints for this text, so I really want you to refer to the textbook, and I'll refer to some of the diagrams just so you can get an idea on some of this stuff. So Figure 2.1 is federal expenditure, and it shows that the three largest federal expenditures are Social Security, Health and Human Services, and the Department of Defense. 61% of tax dollars go to these categories, and 3% goes to education. Think about this, though. It's the elderly in our country that drive where the money goes. Social Security, Health and Human Services, and I would argue defense as well, because we still have a high population that was drafted by the military. So they're the voters, they're the ones that have lived a life and have earned these benefits. So most of our money goes to these categories, and only 3% goes to education. So it's what you do with that 3% that really matters. So the federal government debt per person, you can go to any website and you can calculate. You can go to a national debt calculator, but right now it shows every person owes around $44,000 towards national debt. So hey, if we all kick in $44,000, we can write a check, pay it off, and we won't have a debt. The number is going to continue to increase, which will cause less revenue available for schools. I'm actually going to look and see if I can find somewhere. And go to Google real quick. Guess I can connect in here. So here's the U.S. national debt clock. So right now, according to this, per citizen, it's $57,000, $57,027, and the debt per taxpayer is $154,000, and it just keeps going up and keeps going up. Medicare, Social Security, Defense, War, income security, net interest on debt. Crazy to look at this, and if you can't see this, this is at usdebtclock.org. Just the key thing that I want to note, debt per citizen is $57,027. So it's interesting when you take a look at that. So I'll continue from this slide. So revenue to schools grew between 1920 and 1950, really for two reasons. It grew because, quite frankly, people were having more babies, and it also grew because we were worried about math and sciences because of global competition. Our kind of Cold War with Russia and wondering if there were nukes involved or there weren't nukes really switched this focus to math and sciences, and that's what it was then, and now it's really Title I, ELL, SPED, and standardized testing. So when you're looking at federal money, that's really where the money is going. But the growth happened because we were in competition with other countries and also because people were having more babies. So economics and education are related. Economists have held that education makes contributions to society. We've tried to quantify the value of schooling. We've tried to balance and manage what appropriate school funding is and where it should come from. And I think that's a big idea as well. Economics is the desire and resource which leads to a confrontation, because what we want, our desires, are infinite. We want everything, but resources are finite, meaning that if I can't just take what I want, I have to compete for it. If multiple people are competing for a certain resource, that increases the value of the resource. If multiple people aren't competing for it, that decreases the value. Economics, really in our society, we are a society that's driven on goods and services. People are goods and services, especially in education, because education is a human capital profession. We have conflicts when education is purchased with tax dollars, because then we have multiple people that claim they know what's best for education. Parents, school board members, community members, don't even have kids in the district. They want to know where their tax dollars are going to, so they're going to have say, and this creates the conflict with education. So education is a social good. The most important things that education does is human capital. And we'll come back to this throughout this class, really from money in schools, not so much from the higher ed perspective, but the notion that education really can help drive social welfare and the economic capabilities, because it benefits individuals and it benefits society as a whole, which is what we want education to be doing. So the first publication that ever addressed this was A Nation at Risk, and in all of your classes, I am sure you've heard A Nation at Risk. It was the first time that education really discussed why you could use it to create individuals to produce the differences between skilled labor and unskilled labor. Funding changed. It gave people opportunities for post-secondary success, and it really pushed this notion of people pursuing post-secondary education. That's a good thing. But one of the arguments that I'll make too is when you when you give to something else, you got to take from something else. And early childhood education has suffered in a lot of places because of this. And the perspective I come from is an early childhood perspective, so it's slightly different. So national economic health. If we have universal access to education, then we have a greater store of private wealth, and we've improved the labor market. So if education is equitable, that's a good thing. Globally, our main initiative of the World Bank, and I've done some international work in Vietnam, Turkey, I've studied about Belize, I've been to France to look at their education system. Really, their goal of the World Bank is low-cost basic education to increase availability. When they say that, that's 8th grade education, meaning everybody in the world should have an 8th grade education. Well, obviously all of us support this because we're all of the same ilk. We're or doctoral people. That's going to be different than, you know, a developing country, helping them get an 8th grade education. It's easier said than done. So linking education to unemployment, our textbook shows that individuals with less than a high school diploma have a 14% chance of being unemployed. Individuals with a bachelor's degree have a 4% chance of being unemployed. So the less than high school figure is growing, but the bachelor's degree example is not. But I'm making the argument that a bachelor's degree is becoming the new high school diploma. We're not quite there yet, because there is so much inequity throughout the United States, and really, it's in, you know, if we're looking at the United States, it's really mid-America more than anything else. But, you know, the bachelor's degree isn't going to have the value that it once had, just like the high school diploma doesn't. But if you don't have a high school diploma now, that's a problem, and it's going to continue to be a problem. So is paying for education worth it? And that's a question you have to ask. So there's something called the Exclusion Principle that's very controversial. This is basically this idea that high spending for schools, you know, it's inefficient, and we have to really see where different perspectives on education can go to actually prove something and prove that it changes something. So when you hear me say that and stumble through it, I stumble through it because the only result that can come of that is data, assessment, standardized tests. And we're in a society where that's a big deal, and it's still going to be a big deal. And this realizes that, you know, that's how we're going to measure it. And is that a fair measurement? I think we're all in agreement that it can be in some ways and it can't be in others. So where do schools derive fiscal support? So when I teach this class for building principles, which is what I most frequently teach it for, I ignore this because I'm more worried about their own organizations. I'm going to add some stuff to this because this is a doctoral level course, so you have an understanding of where the money goes and where the money comes from. That's a big idea, and it's a big deal. So most people outside of education believes that the federal government determines what happens in schools. President Obama determines what happens in schools. President Bush determines what happens in schools. President Clinton determines what happens in schools. Remember, the Constitution gave power to the states for education. State power. States. Powers at the state level. 50 different states with 50 wildly different perspectives on education. Congress has managed a long history of influence on schools through indirect and direct measures. One of the things that the book says could change this is if school becomes natural defense. Because if national defense is a social and economic justice and schools are there to fight it, then the federal government should have more control over schools. Does the federal government have more controls over schools? Yeah, it does. Right now, it's changed from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and it's going to continue to increase. Some of you in your careers will never see that pressure. Others of you see the federal pressure every single day in your jobs. I believe it's organization specific. All of you see state pressure and local pressure. Federal pressure, it depends. It really does. So there's a connection to the military and education. There's also a connection to technology in the military. All of our technology really came from the military. We had the Naval Academy in 1845, the Coast Guard Academy in 1876, and the Air Force Academy in 1954. ROTC was truly designed to link schools and military, and the Vocational Rehabilitation Act gave power to military and schools. When we established the National Science Foundation, this stressed the concept of defense education, and the NSF is a big part of our school system. So there is a connection to it. So we can make the argument that yes, this is possible, yes, this is true, yes, this is there. So terrorism in schools. This, after September 11th, the Bush administrators passed higher education relief opportunities for students. This basically said that if there was a national emergency or a war, we're going to give financial aid and debt relief to students. I put this on here because although there's not control to the federal government, it gave the federal government input on how school support should be and how it should be established. And in my opinion, that's a big idea. So many of these issues relate to social justice, and social justice in schools is another thing that you're going to see as a major topic and a big idea on dissertations. So this is support for agriculture, school lunch and milk programs. Now, school lunch programs are federal programs. I don't know much about school lunch in the state of Florida yet. I hope to learn it. But I do know that school lunch in all of the states that I've worked at has increased in cost tremendously because of the Healthy Schools movement. Is it a good thing? Yeah, in theory it's a great movement, but think about what that has done to cost and how that's impacted a lot of different stakeholders and people to afford to pay for meals now. Mandatory breakfast, that's a big cost too. Teacher Protection Act. If you teach in high poverty schools, you're forgiven for being a highly qualified math, science, or special education teacher. That's a good thing, but it gives federal power. And then the Hurricane and Disaster Relief Act. This is a good thing, but it gives federal power. So I do not want you to sit here and listen to this video and say that I'm saying that all of these ideas are bad. They are good ideas, but my question is, do you want the federal government to control education? Or do you want it at the state level, or do you want it at the local level? There isn't a right answer for this. My goal is to just present you the facts and tell you that you'll see the majority of controls are state level, but this is justifying why the federal government has more input in schools. So the U.S. Supreme Court ruled where social welfare is concerned, federal government can interject on schools. So this is why federal can take over low-performing schools and schools based on poverty. Title I is a federal stakeholder thing, and it's why it's done at the federal level. And it's done for this very reason, because it's a social welfare. So it's why the mandates for special education are coming federally and not at the state level. You're getting more at the state level, but they're originating federally. So most support for education comes at the state level. If you look at our textbook, Florida is unique in the fact that it's all local. Florida is supported financially by the local government, meaning that it's district control, but in this state, it's county level control. But we're in a state that really is unique because the support is local, and that's great. But if you go elsewhere, the state support drives the education system. The 10th Amendment gives control to the state. If the state yields control to the local government, which has happened in Florida, the local government has the control. Oklahoma doesn't have this. One of the challenges in this state is, in Oklahoma, is the state supplies the majority of funding allocations for education, meaning that whatever the state decides, the districts have to do. Oklahoma has 500 plus school districts. There are all these little small, tiny districts that will merge with each other really more than anything else because of historical precedent and athletics than anything else. But I want to point out this because Alabama and Georgia, who are your surrounding states, the majority of their funding comes from the state level and not the local level. And I think that's a big idea in case you do decide to move to one of those areas. So most specific support is local. That's property taxes and local funding. So many states have local funding conflicts. Florida has this, it's not immune from debate. Hawaii is all local because Hawaii is all one school district. Every island is one giant school district. But Florida, the idea is how should we use the local funding? Where should it go for? What should property taxes be? And we're going to talk about a lot of that throughout this class. So most local shares are determined from the local tax base. The value of property, which starts with a millage rate, which is adjusted based on poverty rates and scarcity of resources. There's the sparsity, isolation, rural location that can lower property values. It might not be as important in Florida, but it is a big deal in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, who are your neighboring states. So federal, state, and local. The majority in the rest of this chapter really looks at state and federal law. You can visit this in your law class, but not really in this class. But really it's just basically saying that education is a state responsibility. So the most important thing is democracy survives if education is there. Most research will point to reduced crime, reduced need for welfare assistance due to education.